A scripture from Genesis. When Rebekah's time came to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright.
Excuse me. Well, talk about bean stew just kind of made me hungry, and even 20 donut holes between services just does not fill me up. All right. That's really bad. What's in a name? You know, many of us already know that the names in ancient times, parents didn't name their children certain names because they sounded good, or necessarily because they're trying to carry on a family name, or because those names were trending in the polls. They named their children certain names because of a hope or an intuition about what this child's life would be about or what it would represent. So, for instance, the name Joshua literally means Yahweh is salvation. Yeah. So who would want to name their child, Yahweh is salvation, but a parent who is hoping that the salvation of Yahweh would be manifest in that child's life. So you already know the most famous person named Joshua in the Bible, not the one who was said to have circled Jericho and the walls came tumbling down, but rather the names may sound familiar when you consider that the Greek version of the name Joshua is Jesus. Yahweh is salvation. Yeah, Jesus. Now, paying attention to names in the Bible is really helpful because, of course, these stories were written in Hebrew or Greek, and so the authors assumed that the audience already knew what these names mean, so they didn't have to describe why these particular characters are named this way that add meaning and nuance to the stories. But we do, because we read them in English. But oftentimes, if you'll even Google the names as you read some of these stories, especially in the Old Testament, you'll find your knowledge of all kinds of insights about the stories themselves. So, for instance, in our story of Jacob and Esau this morning is a case in point. Rebekah and Isaac have given birth to these two twin children, one born right on the heels of the other. And the first child is named Esau. Well, they named the child Esau because Esau means rough or hairy. Now, ostensibly, that's because he came out of the womb that way, rough and hairy. But that also contains an intimation about what Esau's life would be kind of like. Kind of rough and almost animal-like, where he paid more attention to his immediate physical needs than perhaps future less physical needs. Jacob is named Jacob because it means heel. And again, well, he came out of the womb that way. It says he was grabbing his brother's heel as he was pulled out of the womb. But if you look at his life, Jacob, all his life, was like a heel grabber. He was always grabbing onto something by hook or by crook in order to work it to his advantage. Case in point, this story in which his brother comes in starving to death, apparently from the fields, from hunting, and says, "Give me some of that bean stew that you made." And Jacob says, "Well, I'll give it to you, but only provided you you swap your birthright. Like, what a swap. A birthright for a bowl of beans, especially when you consider what a birthright meant in their day. I mean, in their day, the firstborn child inherited a double portion of the family wealth when they died. So came to the firstborn child. It was automatic. So you think about Jacob, what he's done. I mean, it just seems grossly unfair and even unjust what he's doing to his brother. Then again, if Jacob were here this morning, he might say, well, wait a minute. You may think that's unfair and unjust, but what about this whole policy of the firstborn child gets a double share of the family wealth, especially when the secondborn is born only 30 seconds later? Is that fair? And he might also remind us that someone like his brother, who apparently thought so little of his birthright that he would trade it for a bowl of beans, maybe he didn't deserve to have that birthright to begin with, he might argue. Well, with that, whichever way you come down on Jacob, the author of the story clearly sides with him over Esau. Maybe that's because the author also has the benefit of hindsight, sees the full picture of Jacob's life. He's this heel grabber, but yet sometimes he grabs the heel in ways that work for the benefit of the realm. For instance, there's that wild story about him wrestling all night with an angel, and he prevails. He actually grabs that angel, and the angel can't get away, and so the angel says, let go of me, and he says, well, not until, there he is, bargaining again, not until you bless me, then I'll let you go. And so the angel blesses him and changes his name. There again, name. You no longer will be called Jacob, heel grabber, rather you'll be called Israel. If you want to know where the name of Israel came from, it came from right here. This story. Israel, incidentally, means one who strives with God and prevails. So, as R.E.A. Osrael might say, and Israel has been striving with God and wreaking blessing from it ever since. From Jacob, named now Israel, would come 12 sons who would all become fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. So this whole story, starting with the swap of a birthright for a bowl of beans, starts shifting the whole story of the Hebrew people away from what would have gone through Esau through Jacob. And you can imagine, Esau's probably still rolling in his grave to this day, thinking, I swapped all this for a bowl of beans? The Messiah would even come now from Jacob's line, not Esau's. The story is not only significant for the Jewish people, it's also significant for us Christians, and not just in ancient times, but up to our day, because it's part of the deep mythological imagination of Scripture, where, again, they're not necessarily trying to describe exactly what happened historically from moment to moment thousands of years ago. They're trying to represent what happens over and over and over again, patterns of human behavior, patterns of relationship with God that seem to recur over again up to our day. And when we look at this story, there's some important lessons to be learned. Number one of which, probably, is, if you've been given something precious, my God, treat it that way. Otherwise, that precious thing may just be falling through your fingers. You may find yourself no longer having that precious thing if you don't treat it that way. In that respect, I'm reminded of that song by Harry Chapin, Cats in a Cradle, in which the father, his life is the life of his son. He's privileging work over his relationship with his son, and yet the whole time his son is saying, I'm going to be like you, Dad. I'm going to be like you. And then when the father gets old and retires, he realizes his son has become exactly like him and is not privileging the relationship over work either, and has become quite lonely. If you don't treat a gift as the precious gift that it is, it just kind of slips through your finger. Esau might remind us that story of he and his brother go a step further than just simply acknowledging that it'll slip through your fingers, that a gift like that that's so precious, if you're not paying attention, if it comes from God, may slip through your fingers and be given to somebody else who actually appreciates it, who actually is willing to treat it as something very precious. So that's something we do. It's a pattern that we can find in our own lives, isn't it? That we will trade something precious for something that's equivalent of a bowl of beans, or we trade gold for jade oftentimes in our lives. It's just the way life tends to present itself to us in these awkward trades that somehow we make even despite our best judgment at times. That's why we need the Scriptures to keep reading and rereading these stories to remind us of these patterns. So maybe if we would remember the stories like this, we might not make such a bad trade more often than we do. And so that's why we keep going to the Scriptures. Like you read the Scriptures every day, right? You keep on reading them and going over them. And oh, are you trading time spent with this precious gift of Scripture for time spent like keeping up with the Kardashians, or what? Have you made a trade here? No, we all succumb to that at times. And these days, I must confess that I see more trading of precious things for the equivalent of a bowl of beans amongst Christians than I've ever seen or imagined possible in my entire life. Take, for instance, that classic, precious, deeply held Christian notion of grace. Not limited to Christians, but certainly that's core to our tradition. Grace, God's overwhelming grace, universal grace. Well, even as early as the first century, that there was already people kind of trading grace for lesser things. If the author of the book of Hebrews, for instance, takes on his own audience saying, listen, if you're going to give up something as foundational as grace, well, then the root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble. Trouble indeed. Think about it. The earliest Christians, what they saw happening on the cross was a central revelation of God's grace, that it goes out to all people, and God's salvation goes out to all people, not just a chosen few, is even available for the very people who crucified Jesus. So if it's available for them, certainly is available for all of us. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus being that Passover lamb, God passing over now the righteous and the unrighteous, and always giving us second chances, always offering us a salvation which has already come. Already come. All we have to do is receive it then to benefit from that. And how quickly it devolved. Even in Paul's day, he's writing his entire letter to the Galatians is all a defense of grace. Paul kept arguing this grace, about this universal grace, a salvation that we're already saved. So why don't you, if you'll just receive it as a gift, that's all it takes. And people kept saying, this is too good to be true. This is wishful thinking. This will only, if people think it's that easy to, all you have to do is accept grace, then they will use that as an excuse to sin all the more. Oh yeah, God's fine with me now, I'll just go sin. And Paul kept saying, you don't get it. If you actually receive grace after knowing you failed and admitting you failed, if you actually receive grace and forgiveness, the last thing you want to do is make the same mistake over again. You want to be like the one who's given you this grace. You want to be giving grace like you've received it. You want to be giving love like you've received it. So already in his day, people are trading this amazing grace for lesser things, and the root of bitterness springing up and causing trouble. These days, I see a whole lot of Christians trading grace and salvation, universal salvation, for a whole huge pot of self-righteousness and self-righteous indignation towards those who don't believe the particular way they do, thinking that salvation comes only to themselves, only to them if you believe a certain way or act a certain way. Basically, only if you deserve grace, then you'll get grace. Does that even add up? I mean, isn't grace by definition something you get when you don't deserve it? There's no such thing as grace to those who deserve something. There's only grace for the undeserving. So if we have to believe a certain way or act a certain way in order to deserve grace, it's no longer grace, but something else. It's actually following the law, which Paul says kills us because we're never able to follow the law like we should. And so the bitter root of that stew comes up in our own day and starts to create havoc and trouble in our midst. Because if you believe this way, that you are amongst the saved, you are amongst the chosen, grace has come to you but not to others for whatever reason. They're worshiping the wrong God, or they're not believing the right way about Jesus, or what have you. It starts to work its way out in ways you act in society, and also the ways you vote, quite frankly. All of politics tends to be formed, the way we act politically tends to arise from our understandings of reality, and our understandings of reality are formed by our understandings of God. Even if we say we don't believe in God, well, that's a part of your understanding of reality then. And so our beliefs are actually work themselves out, and if you believe that you are part of the elect and other people are going to hell for all of eternity, for instance, well, quite frankly, it's a lot easier to bomb people who you think have no share in the truth. It's a lot easier to do a whole lot of really horrible things, not pay attention to other people of other cultures or other religions as if you have the corner on the truth and they don't. It's a lot easier to deny access to health care to people who you think that haven't received the grace and love of God, or to hold on to privileges for yourself and deny them to others, like a living wage, like citizenship in a country where they're not being split by civil war or starvation, those kinds of things. The ways that we understand God and our relationship with God very much affect our political outcomes. Now, lest you think I've just swapped the preciousness of a nonpartisan gospel for the bean stew of partisan politics, well, we could turn our attention to progressive Christians too, but that we may just need to prepare ourselves for.
Thanks. From Paul's letter to the Hebrews. Pursue peace with everyone, and the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and through it may become defiled. See to it that no one becomes like Esau, an immoral and godless person who sold his birthright for a single meal.
Yeah, good thing we on the progressive end of the theological swimming pool never swap gold for jade, or our birthright for a bowl of beans, or do we? I wonder. With all appreciation, of course, for the tribe we're in, I do think we could look at certain areas where we could stand some to be paying attention to this story of Jacob and Esau. What particularly concerns me about our own tribe is oftentimes we swap our birthright just to be known as Christians for this kind of obscure, nebulous thing. We tend to define ourselves, a lot of progressive Christians, more by what we're not than who we are or whose we are. So if we think that some brand of Christianity does the Bible badly, well, we won't do the Bible so much. If they do Jesus badly, well, we won't do Jesus so much. If they do prayer badly, well, we won't do prayer so much. And if they do evangelism badly, well, we're certainly not going to talk about our faith to our friends or colleagues or anything like that. We're just not going to do it. And pretty soon we kind of give away all those classic pieces that really makes the faith vital because somebody else is doing it badly. What do we have left? Well, we say, well, we're open and affirming of all people. Come one, come all. Well, nobody really wants to come to our party if there's nothing going on in there. They want to know, well, okay, who are you and whose are you and what are you about? And if you're only ever defining yourselves by what you're not or what you're free from, not what you're free for, well, there's not a lot there. Of course, this isn't about all progressive Christians, but there's certainly a tendency that we have to deal with, just like there's tendencies in conservative Christianity that they've got to be aware of. I think what concerns me most about our own tribe or band of Christianity is that the whole notion of submitting oneself to God is very much downplayed. I'll bet you even when I said submitting ourselves to God, that just suddenly the hairs I could see on the back of some of our necks, you've got to go up, right? Submitting? No, we're about freedom as progressives, right? We're freedom of all that dogma and the doctrine and all those horrible notions of God. We're free of all those things, and so why would we submit? Well, certainly there's a lot of, one could rightly point to a lot of ways that submission has been used badly. And by submission, I mean turning one's life and love and hopes and dreams over to our Creator. There's a lot of ways that whole notion of turning yourself over to God has been used in corrupt ways, like the ways that pastors will talk about submitting to God, but what they're really talking about is submitting to themselves, their own notion of God, or the way that some Christians will say submit to a God, but to submit to a God that would burn 2/3 of the world in a fiery hell for eternity. Is that the God that we're really supposed to be submitting to? Or is that more like a version of Satan? Right? And so there's real reasons for not submitting to such a God. Or submission has also been used to degrade people or to imply that you just need to beat yourself up and continue to beat yourself up so you could submit to this God on a throne that has severe anger management issues. I mean, that's not submission that's healthy. And so people will rightly say, stay away from that. But just because submission to God, turning our lives over, has been used in bad ways, all that means is that you should be very careful about the God you submit to. Right? You need to really be clear about who are you turning your life over to, because it tends to work its way out in positive or negative ways, depending on that kind of God. So, if we're just going to say, well, no, I'm not going to submit, I'm free of all this stuff, what really ends up happening is that progressive Christianity turns into basically a version of, I'll just do whatever the heck I want and expect that God will bless it, whatever. I'm free of all that doctrine, so I'll just do what I want. So it's more like my will be done rather than thy will be done. Now, if we would submit, for instance, to a God who truly loves us beyond our wildest imagination, then we're really turning our lives over to someone or something or some entity, some consciousness that is far more aware of life than we are, far more aware of us than we are, far more aware of what's going on in the world than we are. And if we would turn our lives over to the guidance and the love and grace of that God, well, then we can only do well. But if we're going to say, no, I'm not submitting, well, it's really hard to make the connection. God kind of wants your life, or is perfectly content, seemingly, to say, okay, well, if you don't want to do it my way or with me, then do it on your own and see how that goes. I mean, God gives us the free will to do that. God does not force God's self on us. It's like God wants us to freely choose. And that's when it starts getting good. Submission seems so hard, and it is hard. It's hard on a daily basis. For me as a pastor, it's still hard. On a daily basis, in my daily prayers, the first thing I have to do is bring myself into that sense of letting go and letting God. But once it happens, once you cross that threshold, it becomes like, oh, that was the most easy, most natural thing I've ever done. And so I go, why didn't I do that 10 minutes ago, or 10 days ago, or 10 years ago? Right? Now, if this talking about submitting to God, makes you nervous, just remember Bob Dylan. You got to serve somebody. Maybe the devil or maybe the Lord, but you've got to serve somebody. Who are you serving? If it's not yourself, who or what are you serving? And is that thing or entity you're serving really serving your own needs? Now, if you're nervous about letting go and submitting to a God who's of any kind, then I would suggest doing this. Try for the next 30 days, praying every day to the God who you could envision giving your life to. Don't pray to my God or to somebody else's God, but ask yourself, what kind of God could I legitimately, and would I want to turn my life over to, my loves, my hopes, my dreams? And then pray to that God. Say, if this is the true God, then I truly give myself to you. And I will keep on asking every day for your guidance to lead me into your will, knowing that following your will is ultimately meeting my will, because you are the God that I would want to submit to. And I will keep submitting to you until or unless proven that you are not the God, you are not the true God. And if you're not this God who I'm praying to, then all bets are off. I retain the right to not submit to you. Right? Do that for 30 days and see what happens. What do any of us have to lose other than a bowl of bean stew? Amen.